Malik Jackson was a decorated black soldier trained to serve disciplined to de-escalate. But when he was pulled over just outside his own base, the uniform he wore couldn't protect him. He followed orders. He stayed calm. And yet one bullet ended everything. Now the man who shot him walks into court unaware of the truth, waiting to strike back. Can justice survive when a soldier's loyalty is mistaken for threat? If this story moves, you don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Now let's hear what really happened. They said it was just another traffic stop. But if you were standing there that morning like I was just off the side of the main road outside Clark Field Base, you'd know it wasn't. It was still dark out. Not quite dawn, but the kind of gray that made everything look colder than it was. The highway was empty except for one car moving slow and steady past the edge of the fence line. That car belonged to Malik Jackson. He wasn't in uniform, but you could still tell. Some men carry that discipline in their posture, in the way they check their mirrors, in the way they drive just under the speed limit because they know what they represent. Malik had just finished an overnight rotation with the training unit. Word was he'd stayed back late to help some new recruits who were struggling with formations. That was the kind of soldier he was. Then came the lights. Red and blue lit up the asphalt as a patrol cruiser pulled up behind him. The driver's door opened, and Sergeant Dalton Reeves stepped out like he owned the road. I'd seen him around town before. Young buzz-cut, sharp jaw, always walking like the law itself, was stitched into the back of his jacket. He approached Malik's car with his hand already on his holster. "License and registration," he said loud enough that even from where I stood I heard it clear. Malik responded the way we're taught. Calm, clear, respectful. He reached, slowly handed over his license, then reached into his inner coat pocket to pull out his military ID, held it up with 2 fingers. Said, "Sir, I'm Sergeant Malik Jackson, active duty out of Clarkfield." But Dalton didn't even glance at the ID. Just stared at him with narrowed eyes like he was reading something else entirely, something not printed on paper. "What's this?" Dalton said, squinting at the card. "You got this online?" Malik blinked. You could see the confusion cross his face. "No, sir. That's my issued military ID. You can call base security if you want to verify." Dalton didn't move, didn't radio anyone, just stood there breathing a little too hard for someone looking at a man offering cooperation. Malik, sensing the tension, tried again. "I can show you my orders. They're in the glove compartment." He moved slowly, both hands visible, clearly announced what he was doing. But just as he leaned slightly to open the compartment, I heard it. A shot. Just one. And then nothing. Time froze. Malik slumped against the driver's side window, blood already blooming through the fabric of his coat. His body didn't jerk. He didn't scream. He just folded. From where I stood, I could see it happen and still not believe it. Dalton didn't shout, didn't give warning. He just pulled the trigger like he was swatting a threat, like Malik's ID meant nothing, like Malik himself meant even less. The ID card fell to the floorboard. I saw it flutter there beside a silver badge, one I'd seen clipped to his chest many times before when he wore his uniform proud at the grocery store on Sundays. Dalton backed up a few steps, radioed for medical, then for backup. I heard him say the words, "Suspect failed to comply." Reached for something. He never checked the glove compartment, never even confirmed if Malik had a weapon. He didn't need to. His version had already started writing itself. Minutes later, another officer arrived. They pulled tape, closed off the road. I heard the second officer ask if Dalton had seen the ID. Dalton shrugged, said didn't look legit. But here's the thing. Malik's dash cam had been recording the entire time. Silent, unblinking. It saw everything. It saw Malik's hands. It saw his words. It saw the calm. And it saw a bullet pierce through that calm without warning. I stayed back. Didn't say anything that day. I watched them take Malik's body away. Watched them let Dalton sit in the cruiser untouched, sipping from a water bottle while blood dried on the pavement 10 feet away. There was no outrage, no press, just one more man gone and a silence too loud to ignore. But silence doesn't mean truth, and Malik's camera, that little lens wedged between his dashboard and the windshield, was about to speak louder than any report Dalton could file, because that uniform may not have saved Malik in those final seconds, but it was about to put his killer on trial. And that's where the story really begins. The call came just after 6:00 a.m. Celeste Jackson was sitting at her kitchen table staring at the steam rising from a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. The phone rang twice. On the third ring, she answered. The voice on the other end didn't say, "Ma'am, I'm sorry," or, "There's been an incident." It said only this: "There's been a fatality. Your son, Malik Jackson. You'll be contacted by authorities shortly." Then the line went dead. No explanation, no apology, no questions. Just 6 seconds that cracked a mother's world into silence. She sat there for a long time. Didn't cry. Didn't scream. Just stared at the cup that had long gone cold. At Clark Field Regional Hospital, a doctor in military fatigues was scrubbing down from an emergency shift when he saw the gurney come through. He moved to assist out of habit but stopped short when he caught a glimpse of the patient's face. His hand dropped. "Sergeant Malik Jackson," he asked softly, as if hoping he was wrong. The paramedic didn't answer, just handed over the tag gunshot wound. Status deceased. The doctor stood still. He remembered the young man who had once walked into the field hospital with a fractured wrist refusing pain meds until every injured recruit had been taken care of. The one who saluted when no one else did. The one who never left training drills early even in the rain. Now he was just another file, another report, another silence. Later that morning, deep inside a secure room at the base, a junior tech officer clicked play on a file pulled from Malik's dash cam. The footage was clear. Front view. No edits, no glitches. He watched the stop, watched Malik's hands, watched the moment his fingers touched the glove compartment and the shot rang out. He didn't say a word. He simply stood up, downloaded the file to a secure drive, and sent it through internal encrypted protocol to Colonel Raquel Haynes. She received it mid-briefing, opened the file without hesitation, watched the footage once, then a second time. Her jaw tightened, her hands didn't shake. Then she locked her screen, stood, and told her aide to cancel all non-essential meetings. No one asked why. They didn't need to. Back in town, Celeste made her way to the local police precinct. She didn't speak when she walked through the door. She didn't need to. Her face said everything. She waited 20 minutes. No one approached her. Finally, a young officer walked past, glanced at her, disappeared, and returned holding a clear plastic evidence bag. Inside it, Malik's wallet, his watch, his phone, and a blood-stained keychain. The officer handed it to her like handing over a receipt. "That's all they released," he said. Celeste looked at the bag, then at the man. "No one's going to tell me what happened." He shrugged. "It's under review." She wanted to scream, but she didn't. She walked out into the daylight holding what was left of her son. Meanwhile, in a small apartment above a barber shop 2 blocks from the courthouse, Eli Moreno sat hunched over a cracked laptop flipping through local news wires. He wasn't a full-time reporter. Not yet. Mostly he covered community events and wrote opinion pieces that got buried under the headlines. But something about the way people were whispering outside the precinct that morning caught his attention. He overheard a man on the phone say, "They shot a soldier. Right here." Didn't even check who he was. Eli's pen froze. He made 2 calls. One to a source he knew in the coroner's office, the other to an off-duty EMT who owed him a favor. By afternoon he had a name, Malik Jackson. He didn't have an angle yet, didn't have confirmation, but his gut told him this wasn't a routine incident. He wrote 1 sentence in his notebook and circled it. What if they killed discipline and called it defiance? The silence after the shot wasn't just around Malik's car. It stretched into the hospital where familiar faces stayed quiet. It seeped through the walls of the precinct where no one wanted to speak. It hung in Celeste's house between her heartbeat and the fading smell of her son's laundry. And it rang loudest in Eli's ears as he realized he was no longer just observing. He was about to follow the thread of something bigger. And somewhere inside a sealed room on base, a colonel had already started preparing for what would come next. Because silence doesn't last forever, not when the truth is waiting to be heard. By the time the trial began, the story had spread beyond the local headlines. It wasn't just about a shooting anymore. It was about a question too big to ignore: what happens when a soldier survives war zones only to die at a traffic stop on American soil. The courtroom filled early. Spectators, reporters, officers in uniform, some came for answers, others for a show, but no one said much. It was the kind of silence that settles in when people know something sacred's been broken, but can't agree on who broke it. Dalton Reeves walked in first. Not in handcuffs, not in shame, just calm. Straight posture. A polished blue suit, his badge pinned to the lapel like he still believed it gave him protection. His lawyer, Roger Beckman, followed close behind a man whose tie was always perfect and whose smile never reached his eyes. Beckman didn't offer comfort or reassurance. He didn't need to. His presence alone said this will be handled, like every other case before it. On the opposite side, the air shifted as Diona Wells rose, a tall black woman with steel in her voice and calm fire in her eyes. She didn't wear jewelry, didn't raise her tone. She didn't have to. The room adjusted to her the moment she spoke. "Your Honor," she began, "we are not here to accuse every officer. We are here to hold one man accountable, and we are here because the uniform my client's son wore did not protect him. It made him a target." And just like that, the room stopped breathing. Celeste sat in the second row behind Diona, her hands wrapped around a small wooden box she held in her lap. It was polished smooth and barely large enough to hold the folded uniform inside the one Malik had packed carefully the night before deployment, the one he never got to wear again. She didn't cry, not yet. She just kept her eyes forward. She wanted to hear every word spoken in that room, because silence had taken enough from her already. Across the aisle, Dalton didn't glance at her once. Eli Moreno leaned against the back wall, scribbling in a small notepad. He wasn't part of any media outlet, not officially. But his notes were cleaner than most reporters, and his observations sharper. He stared at Dalton's face for a long time, watched the man blink, breathe, nod when the judge addressed him. Eli tilted his head slightly, wrote one line beneath the others, cold, like he shot the son and came to bury the mother. The prosecution laid out its timeline, Malik's movements, the time he left base, the exact coordinates of the traffic stop. The dashcam footage was entered as evidence but not yet shown. Diona waited. She knew timing mattered. Truth didn't just need to be told, it had to land. Beckman, for his part, remained motionless during most of it. He objected only once, quietly, and the judge sustained it. But everyone could tell he was waiting for the right moment to turn the narrative. Not deny the shot that part was on video, but to explain it, to wrap it in fear, in training, in policy, as if following a manual excused murder. Celeste shifted slightly, her fingers tightening around the wooden box. The courtroom air felt colder now, like it knew what had happened but was afraid to say it out loud. Dalton sat like a man watching a rerun. Nothing seemed new to him. Nothing seemed to reach him. He didn't flinch when they said Malik's name, didn't blink when they read the charge. Murder while executing a traffic stop. Eli noticed something else. Dalton's eyes weren't on the judge, or the jury, or even Beckman. They kept drifting toward the American flag in the corner like he needed it to remind himself he still belonged here. But no flag could shield him from what was coming. Not this time. Because sitting behind that table wasn't just a grieving mother or a high-powered attorney. It was something harder to ignore, the weight of truth sharpened, focused, and ready to speak. And it hadn't even begun yet. Beckman stood buttoning his suit slowly before walking to the center of the courtroom like a man rehearsed in controlling silence. His voice, calm but deliberate, told the jury that this was not a murder trial. They were here to understand a tragic consequence of a lawful command. He painted Malik as non-compliant, edgy, too quick, with his hands near the seat. Officer Reeves followed protocol, he said. He was trained to protect lives, including his own. Beckman paused. We cannot hold a man criminal for choosing not to die. From the bench, the judge made no comment. Dalton sat with his hands clasped, eyes forward, showing no emotion as Beckman returned to his seat. Then Diona Wells rose. Her presence alone shifted the air. She didn't stride. She stood still for a beat, then turned to the jury with quiet certainty. You're about to hear a version of the story written by someone who never asked who Malik Jackson was. A man who never even touched the ID card covered in that boy's blood. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Malik was shot reaching for a second form of ID, she said. Not a weapon. There was no weapon. Just a license. And a flag. Folded in his glove box. That was his crime. Dalton didn't flinch. But Eli Moreno, watching from the far aisle, scribbled a note without looking down. He believed Malik was armed. But where is the weapon? Only a flag never got to be saluted again. The first witness called was Officer Troy Lannister, Dalton's patrol partner that morning. He walked to the stand with the stiffness of someone balancing fear and loyalty. Beckman asked him routine questions first about procedure protocol, how fast things unfold when adrenaline is high. Lannister answered cleanly. Practiced. But when Diona took her turn, she pressed harder. Did Malik Jackson ever raise his voice? No, ma'am. Did he exit the vehicle? No. Did you see him holding anything before the shot? Troy hesitated. I couldn't confirm what it was. Couldn't or didn't. The pause returned, then didn't. And did Officer Reeves retrieve any object from the car after firing? Troy looked to the defense table, then away. No. Eli underlined something. 2 words. Didn't look. Beckman returned with the shift in tone. Ms. Wells, he said smoothly, how often do fake military IDs circulate in street-level deception? You and I both know they're not hard to make. Diona didn't answer right away. She turned toward Celeste. In the back row, Celeste Jackson hadn't moved since the trial began. Her hands rested gently on a small wooden box on her lap, the shape barely visible beneath the white cloth draped over it. Her fingers tightened. She stood slowly, uninvited. My son didn't order this from a print shop, she said, her voice breaking the rhythm of the room. The government gave it to him, after they trained him to jump out of planes in enemy territory. That badge was earned, and it bled. The courtroom hushed. No one interrupted. The judge looked down but said nothing. Beckman adjusted his tie lips, pressing into a thin line. Someone in the gallery whispered, she's right. A man near the aisle, leaned forward and shook his head. They didn't even check his damn ID. Whispers became a low murmur. The temperature of the room changed. No longer a debate of facts, but of faith. Not in law, but in justice. Dalton looked down for the first time. On the stand, Lannister clenched his jaw. Diona walked back to her table slowly, not smiling. She didn't need to. The room was shifting. Not toward verdict, but toward truth. And truth has its own gravity. Eli closed his notebook for a moment, watching the jury. One woman in her 60s blinked rapidly, holding something back. A man near the corner leaned against his seat, arms crossed not in skepticism, but in discomfort. The kind that comes when the story you were told stops making sense. It was no longer about whether Dalton feared for his life. It was about whether that fear was allowed to replace evidence. And for the first time since the trial began, that question hovered over every word spoken next. By the afternoon of the 3rd day, the tension in the courtroom felt like a held breath. Even the judge had started watching more than presiding, sensing something unspoken winding its way to the surface. Diona Wells stood again, this time with a sealed flash drive in her hand. Her voice was calm, almost soft, but carried the weight of something heavy. Your Honor, she began, this footage was submitted through confidential military channels and verified by the Department of Defense. It's from the dash cam inside Mr. Jackson's vehicle. I'm formally requesting it be shown to the court. Judge Harmon leaned forward, brow furrowed, and extended his hand for the drive. No one spoke as he plugged it into the monitor beside him. The room was silent, but not still, like a storm was waiting for permission to break. He watched the screen alone. 10 seconds, then 20. Then nearly a full minute passed before he leaned back, removed his glasses, and nodded once. Let the jury see it. The lights dimmed, the screen brightened, and the room turned its attention to the only voice that mattered now, Malik's. There he was, alive, calm, sitting behind the wheel just outside the base, his uniform folded in the back seat. The early morning light flickered through the trees. A siren wailed behind him, and he pulled to the shoulder without hesitation. Dalton Reeves approached from the driver's side. There was no rush, no shouting. Malik rolled down the window. Good morning, sir, he said, voice steady. Here's my license. He passed it through the window. Dalton didn't speak. He looked it over, then asked for more ID. Malik reached calmly toward the glove box. Sir, here's my military ID, Malik said, turning slightly. There was a pause. A long one. Not a warning, not a threat. Just silence. And then the gunshot. The sound cracked through the speakers like thunder through glass. Malik's head snapped back. Blood sprayed the window. His hand, still clutching the military ID, fell limp against the console. The card slid from his fingers, landing between the seats. The camera caught every frame. The courtroom was frozen. Dalton stepped back in the video, his weapon still raised, breathing heavily. But Malik never moved again. No aggression, no raised voice, no weapon. Just a man obeying an order and paying for it with his life. The screen went black. For a full 5 seconds, the room didn't breathe. Dalton sat pale, staring ahead. Beckman looked down at his notes, hands unmoving. Even Judge Harmon's mouth had tightened into a grim line. Eli. Moreno in the gallery didn't reach for his notepad this time. His pen rested across the open page, untouched. There was nothing left to write. The story had written itself. Beckman rose slowly, adjusting his cuffs, clearly scrambling for footing. He cleared his throat and spoke with forced control. Your Honor, while powerful, this footage captures a single angle. It doesn't conclusively prove what was perceived by Officer Reeves in that moment. Perception is not always aligned with reality. And in matters of life and death, Diona interrupted not loudly but sharply enough that everyone heard her first word slice the room in half. Perception. She turned toward the jury. We just watched a man get shot for complying, not arguing, not running, complying. She took a step forward, voice firmer now. Mr. Beckman wants to argue over perception, fine. Then let's talk about whose perception gets to matter. She pointed toward the screen, now blank but still vivid in everyone's mind. Malik Jackson said, Sir, here's my ID. Those were his last words. Calm. Respectful. He reached for a card. A card issued by the U.S. military. She let that sit. Then he was shot in the head. No warning, no escalation, just silence, and a bullet. Her eyes swept the room, landing briefly on Dalton before returning to the jury. And now we're debating whether the angle was clear enough. Beckman shifted uncomfortably. Dalton didn't move. Diona turned back to the judge. With respect, Your Honor, I'd like to pose one final question. She looked to the jury again. Whose intent matters more, the man who killed or the man who died trying to prove he belonged? No one answered. They didn't need to. The silence said everything. Celeste lowered her head, her hand gently resting on the wooden box again. But this time, she looked less alone. A few heads in the audience turned toward her with something different in their eyes. Not pity, not sorrow, but recognition. Outside the courthouse, protesters had already begun gathering. Signs raised, faces tense. The footage would soon leak, and the world would soon see what the courtroom just did. Inside, Judge Harmon finally spoke. This court will recess for the day. But everyone knew the real trial had just begun. When the court resumed the next morning, the atmosphere was no longer tense. It was reverent. Something had shifted. The clip had stripped away every layer of pretense, and what remained was a room full of people waiting not for arguments, but for truth. Celeste Jackson stepped up to the witness stand. She wore a plain navy blue dress and held nothing but a folded piece of paper. Her shoulders were upright but not rigid. Her eyes were heavy but unafraid. When she raised her right hand to be sworn in, she did so without hesitation. And then, as she sat down, a kind of stillness settled over the courtroom. Not the silence of discomfort, but of listening. My name is Celeste Jackson, she began. I am the mother of Specialist Malik Isaiah Jackson, and I'm not here to talk about laws or angles or protocol. She looked toward the jury, not accusing, not begging, just holding their eyes. I'm here to tell you who my son was, because I watched the world strip him down to a headline, and that's not how he should be remembered. Her voice didn't crack. It didn't rise. But every word seemed to carry weight far greater than its syllables. Malik was born in a housing project outside Montgomery. His father left when he was 5. We never had much. Sometimes not even heat. But he never complained. He just read whatever he could find. He used to borrow books from the school janitor because the library closed too early for kids like him. A small smile tugged at her lip just once. He told me once, Mama, I don't want to just survive. I want to serve. I want to build something. She glanced briefly toward Dalton. He looked away. When he enlisted, he didn't tell me until after the paperwork was signed. Said he didn't want me to talk him out of it. He trained harder than anyone. I used to get letters from his commanding officers saying, he makes people better just by standing next to them. I kept every one. She unfolded the paper in her hand gently, as if it were something sacred. This letter came just before he shipped out last. He didn't know I'd ever read it to a courtroom. But I think he knew I might have to. She paused to breathe, not because she was shaken, but because the words mattered. If anything happens, just speak, she read. I'll still be standing where I fall. A few jurors blinked hard. One pressed her fingers to her lips. Celeste continued. He didn't have to be in the field that night. He had leave. But he told his superior he wanted to stay behind and train the new recruits. Said, "Someone trained me when they didn't have to. I owe that forward." She folded the letter and held it close. That's the man Officer Reeves saw through a window, and never gave the chance to speak. Beckman rose slowly. Perhaps he thought the room had softened. Perhaps he thought silence was a sign of submission. "Mrs. Jackson," he said, "your son's military record is commendable, but service, even bravery, doesn't place someone above the law. Loyalty doesn't exempt anyone from responsibility. It might have landed if the room had still belonged to him, but it didn't." Before Celeste could respond, Diana stood, not objecting, not interrupting, but requesting to redirect. She approached the witness stand, slowly meeting Celeste's eyes with something gentle but clear. "Mrs. Jackson," she said, "your son's actions, his choice to serve his letters, his quiet heroism, what do they mean to you now?" Celeste's eyes misted, but she didn't break. "They mean," she whispered, "that he deserves to be heard. Even now. They mean that we don't get to erase someone because we're uncomfortable with what happened. They mean this country trained him, trusted him with lives, and then doubted the same ID that sent him into war." Diana turned slightly toward the jury. "Is it so hard to believe," she asked softly, "that the man who gave everything for this country should be trusted with his own truth?" There was no further cross-examination. The judge called a brief recess, but no one moved. The quiet in the room wasn't hesitation anymore, it was respect. Outside, a crowd had begun to gather again. This time they weren't chanting. They were waiting, because what was unfolding inside wasn't just a trial, it was something closer to confession. And in the center of it all sat a mother who had already lost everything, and yet somehow was still standing. When the next name was called, the courtroom didn't react. Most people didn't recognize it. Kenny Marks, just another witness. But when the doors opened and a young man in his early 20s stepped in wearing a faded base security uniform and clutching his ID like a shield, something about his presence shifted the air. He looked like he didn't belong, too young, too nervous. His steps hesitant, his face pale but determined, like someone who'd spent weeks deciding whether to come at all. As he was sworn in, his voice cracked on the word truth. The judge waited patiently. Everyone did. The prosecutor stepped forward and spoke gently, as if she knew too much pressure might send him running. "Mr. Marks, where were you on the morning of April 14th? Kenny cleared his throat. "I was working Gate 2 at Clarkfield Base." "You're a civilian contractor?" "Yes, ma'am. I'd just finished my 3rd week." "Do you recall seeing Malik Jackson that morning?" A long pause. Kenny's eyes dropped to his lap. Then slowly he nodded. "I do." "Can you describe what you saw?" He took a breath like it hurt to pull in. It was early, still dark, but I remember him because he stood out. He looked sharp. Hair cut clean, uniform pressed. I checked his credentials, his ID was real. Everything was real. The prosecutor waited. Kenny's voice began to steady, though his hands remained clenched. Before he pulled out, he looked at me and said, "Stay safe, son." His eyes lifted cloudy now. That was the last thing he said. Like he knew something could go wrong. Like he knew it had before. No one breathed. Celeste, seated in this gallery, closed her eyes. The prosecutor nodded gently. "Thank you. Did you report this encounter before today?" "No," he admitted. "I didn't." "Why not?" "I was scared." "Scared of what?" He hesitated, then glanced at the defense table, not directly at Dalton, but near enough. "A man came to my door 2 days later. Said he was checking in on anyone who might have been on duty that morning. Said it was best to keep things quiet for the good of the base." He paused. "He didn't threaten me, not directly, but he said a young guy like me, well, I had a future. That future might not look the same if I got too involved in something above my clearance." You could feel it the way the room collectively stiffened. "What changed?" the prosecutor asked. Kenny swallowed. "I saw her, Malik's mother, on the news. She was holding his uniform, and she said, 'If my son won't speak, I will.' I realized I was the one who could have said something but didn't. So I came." From the gallery, Eli Moreno jotted down every word, but more than that, he was listening, feeling. You didn't need a Pulitzer to know when the moment shifted in a trial. You just needed to recognize the tremor in the floor beneath your feet. The judge looked toward the defense. Cross-examination. Beckman stood, slowly, walked to the podium and adjusted his tie. "Mr. Marks," he said, Voice calm, rehearsed. Are you absolutely sure it was Mr. Jackson you saw? It was dark, you said. I'm sure. No confusion possible. Not even the chance that the individual you saw resembled the defendant. No, sir. He called me son. He was calm. He had a gentle way about him. That's not something I confuse. Beckman tried again. Is it possible that your memory's been influenced by the media coverage? The public emotion. Kenny's answer came quieter now, but firmer. What I remember doesn't come from a headline. It comes from a man's voice telling me to stay safe before heading into danger. I live with that voice every morning I go to work. The courtroom held still, and then softly, almost as if to himself, Kenny added, he was the last person who should have been feared. The last. The judge didn't say anything at first. Neither did the jury. But it was there in the shifting shoulders, the lowered eyes, the quiet tear someone tried to wipe away before it showed. The truth had landed, not in a loud explosion, in a whisper. The prosecutor said no more. She simply nodded to Kenny, who left the stand looking lighter somehow, as if speaking had taken something off his back. Outside the courtroom, Eli closed his notebook. In his reporting career, he'd covered a dozen trials like this, trials that started with outrage and ended with disappointment. But this one he thought was different, because for the first time someone didn't just testify, they told the truth as it felt. He knew then this story wouldn't just be about a shooting. It would be about the voices we almost never hear, and the one that finally broke through. And it came from a boy in a wrinkled uniform who walked into a courtroom and refused to stay scared. There was a silence before Diona Wells stood again, and this time she didn't speak right away. Instead, she walked to the witness stand with something in her hands, a folded, blood-stained uniform sealed in a clear evidence bag. The stitching was torn near the collar, the left sleeve soaked in dried crimson. She didn't lift it high. She didn't need to. This, she said, her voice, steady but low, is not evidence. This is a sentence, not one handed down by a court, but by silence, by fear, by the quiet nods of those who looked away. She placed the uniform gently on the wooden edge. This uniform belonged to Staff Sergeant Malik Jackson, decorated soldier, son, instructor of cadets, survivor of 3 tours. What it became, what it was reduced to, was a symbol of how little his service meant to the man who pulled the trigger. The judge didn't interrupt. No one did. Diona stepped back, her gaze sweeping across the courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen, uniforms don't make someone more human. But if this uniform couldn't protect Malik from being gunned down in the street, then what does it take? What shield is enough? There was no rebuttal, no question. After a long breath, the judge leaned forward slightly. The court will now hear testimony from Colonel Raquel Haynes of the United States Army appearing with permission as a character witness. All eyes turned as a tall black woman in full-dress uniform stepped forward. Her presence wasn't loud, but commanding. Her medals caught the light. Her posture was unshakable. She didn't look at the audience or the defense table, only at the judge. I trained Malik Jackson, she began, watched him rise faster than most, not because he wanted rank, but because he believed leadership meant responsibility, and he bore it. She reached into her folder and removed a small sheet of paper. Before I speak further, with your permission, Your Honor, I'd like to read into record a list of commendations awarded to Sergeant Jackson. Permission was granted. And so she began. Bronze Star for Valor, Army Commendation Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster, Joint Service Achievement Medal, Combat Infantryman Badge, National Defense Service Medal. The list went on. Each name another weight placed gently but firmly on the conscience of the room. When she finished, Colonel Haynes looked up. Her voice shifted, dropped lower as though speaking not as an officer, but as someone who had bled and taught and buried too many like him. He wasn't killed in combat, she said. He was executed in calm, in his own country, in his own clothes, on a road he had the right to drive. That line landed hard. There was no movement, no cough, even the air seemed to stop. Then something unexpected happened. A young man in the back, barely 20, maybe younger, stood up. He wore fatigues, not full dress, but real enough. He didn't ask permission. He didn't speak. He just stood at attention and brought his hand up in a crisp salute, directed not at the judge, not at the colonel, but toward the bloodied uniform resting in silence near the front. He held it, for a full 5 seconds, then sat down again. No one dared speak, not even the judge. Celeste blinked hard, her fingers pressed to her lips. Colonel Haynes looked once toward the young man, gave the smallest nod, and turned back to the court. I have buried too many, but I will not let this one be folded into a quiet statistic. Malik trained soldiers. He lifted them. He believed in a future he wouldn't get to see. And now, it's up to us to make sure that future doesn't fail him in death the way we failed him in life. She stepped away. Diona didn't speak again. She didn't need to. That moment between the silence, the folded cloth, and the quiet, defiant salute was louder than any argument. And Eli, sitting in the gallery, scribbled just one sentence in his notebook. Sometimes truth doesn't come in a shout. It comes in the stillness after a soldier stands. When the verdict came, the courtroom didn't cheer, didn't cry, didn't even breathe. The judge's voice was steady, deliberate. Sergeant Dalton Reeves is found guilty of manslaughter in the 1st degree, sentenced to 10 years in state prison. There was a pause after that final word, like the echo hadn't quite reached the back of the room yet. And then quiet murmurs began to rise, not loud but sharp, tense, almost like disbelief trying to find its footing. 10 years. Celeste closed her eyes. Diana didn't flinch. She simply turned her head, leaned toward the judge, and spoke softly enough that only the bench could hear her. Would you be this lenient if it were your son lying in that grave? The judge didn't reply, not with words. But his jaw tightened and he looked down at his notes like they had suddenly become too heavy to carry. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had already gathered, signs held high. Voices tangled in grief and frustration. Some shouted for justice, others for peace. But just as many stood still, arms crossed, eyes narrowed not at the defendant, but at the people mourning him. Eli stepped out quietly, his notebook still tucked under his arm. He wasn't looking for quotes anymore, just watching. That's when a man beside him, older white, in a business coat and clean shoes, leaned slightly toward him and whispered under his breath, "He broke the rule. He deserved it." Eli turned slowly. What rule was that? The man didn't answer, just walked away, disappearing into the blur of reporters and protesters. Back inside, Dalton Reeves had been led away in handcuffs, but not toward the usual correctional transport van. Instead, a black military vehicle waited near the side entrance. No markings, no sound, just a silent engine and 2 uniformed MPs expressionless and stiff as they stood flanking the open rear door. There were no goodbyes, no statement, no press release. Dalton looked up once at the sky. Not the people then climbed into the back of the truck like he was stepping into fog. The doors shut behind him with a finality that didn't echo, didn't clang, just ended. For most, that was the last they ever saw of him. But weeks later, word surfaced not through media, but through the small, unofficial channels of soldiers who whispered only when uniforms weren't listening. A closed military tribunal had been convened. No lawyers, no jury, just a classified review led by high-ranking officers. The charge was not murder. It wasn't even disobedience. It was disgrace. The verdict: dishonorable discharge, immediate stripping of all rank and honors, and transfer to an undisclosed holding facility, permanent confinement without contact for bringing shame to the cloth of the United States Armed Forces. There would be no appeal, no memorial, no name engraved anywhere official. He wasn't just judged by a court. He was erased by the very institution he claimed to represent. And though no headline ever printed it, no paper ever confirmed it, those who wore the uniform knew what had happened. Malik had been denied justice in life, but his uniform had spoken for him in death, and someone somewhere high enough to act without asking had listened. At the edge of Clark Field Base, beneath a low morning sky, and beside a row of solemn boots planted in gravel, a new wooden plaque had been quietly installed. It wasn't part of a government order, no ribbon-cutting ceremony, just a piece of dark oak, sanded by hand letters carved deep into its surface by a veteran with trembling fingers. This is where it should be safest. No name, no rank, no date. Just that single line hammered into memory and left to weather under sun and storm. It faced the main gate, right where Malik Jackson had last saluted, right where he'd said goodbye to the people he served with, not knowing that his final act of discipline would be mistaken for threat. The dedication wasn't official, but everyone came anyway. Celeste stood off to the side, far from the folded chairs and the clean podium no one stepped toward. She didn't want to speak. She'd already said what mattered inside the courtroom, and even that had cost more breath than she'd meant to spend. A military officer approached her silently, holding out a perfectly folded triangle of cloth, red, white, blue crisp at the edges, still smelling faintly of ceremony and soil. She looked at it for a long moment, her fingers twitching at her sides before finally reaching to accept it. She didn't cry. She didn't say thank you. She just nodded once, then held it against her chest like it belonged there, like she wasn't sure if it warmed her or weighed her down. Not far from her, a young boy no more than 8 stood clutching his father's hand, eyes wide behind wireframe glasses. He didn't ask questions. He just whispered softly, almost to himself, "I want to wear that uniform, but I don't want to be shot for it." No one answered him. They didn't need to. The silence around him was answer enough. That night back at his tiny desk, lit only by the soft blue of a cracked screen, Eli Moreno uploaded his final article on the case. He didn't include all the legal jargon. He didn't try to tie the story in a bow. Instead, his headline simply read, "Justice was quiet." But now it echoes. And beneath it, just one photograph. The plaque, the wood, the line. In the days that followed, no massive movements shook the system. No marches overwhelmed the streets. But across barracks and courtrooms and late-night radio shows, something began to shift. Not loud, not sudden, just steady. In schools, teachers discussed the cost of silence. In training camps, new recruits asked harder questions. In homes like Malik's, mothers looked at their sons with both pride and fear, wondering how the two emotions had become so tightly knotted together. And as the screen fades to black, there's only one voice left. The voice from a letter written long before the story began, one no one thought would ever be read aloud. "If they forget my name," Malik had written, "let them remember what I stood for." And that was the story of Malik Jackson. A soldier who followed every rule, served with honor, and still paid the price for the color of his skin. His voice may have been silenced, but through stories like this, it still speaks. If this story touched you, let it keep moving. Let it be the start of something bigger. A conversation, a moment of reflection, a reason to care just a little more. Please, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories for more real, powerful tales that reveal the hidden sides of justice and humanity. Your support gives our team the motivation to keep crafting stories that matter, stories that don't just entertain, but awaken. Because at Mr. Mac's Stories, we don't just tell stories, we echo the truth behind silence. Let this echo stay with you.